What's going on, guys? Aarava here, bringing you Let's Talk F1 2015, and today it's for the Australian Grand Prix. If you're new to my channel in this series, it's basically a series where I'm going to be analysing the aerodynamic parts of the cars ahead of the Grand Prix race and qualifying sessions, and just looking at their general pace in practice 1 and 2, and seeing what we can kind of look from that and what sort of insights we can get into. So we're going to get straight into it by looking at all the different cars and seeing what updates they've brought, and also talking about their pace during free practice 1 and free practice 2. Obviously, Australia, the first round of the season, so it's all very, very raw. All the cars are very delicate, apart from the Mercedes, seemingly, but we'll get to that later. But yeah, in general, all the cars are a bit delicate. There's a few niggling issues that every single team needs to get rid of ahead of free practice 3 and then qualifying, and then what will be eventually the first race where the first points are scored. So let's get straight into it with the first team, which will be Mercedes. So Mercedes, the only team that look completely bulletproof. They were absolutely dominant once again in free practice 1 and free practice 2, just like they were throughout testing, really, and what we predicted from last year's running, and it seems they've still got the advantage. They were about 1 second ahead of the rest of the field still, so Mercedes still very much in the driving seat for this season, and they are so confident of how far ahead they are in terms of reliability and all that, that the car they've brought to Australia has no upgrades on it. There's no actual aerodynamics to kind of analyze from testing. You know, the exact same car they ran at the last Barcelona test is the car they brought to Australia, so there are no new parts on this Mercedes car. The only thing you could say is maybe the camera pod positions we've seen, or you can see right now on screen. Mercedes ran the new camera pods at the very end of the Barcelona testing, which I didn't ever cover. So it's just a new camera pod. Basically, they've got these very thin structures coming up to the camera pods that are fully legal, and Mercedes just done the best job to kind of get around the rules of regulations where you need to place these camera pods, and it doesn't aid too much, apart from it may give you a little slight aerodynamic benefit because of the way the camera pods are shaped. Obviously, they're shaped sort of like a nice curved wing, but that's about it. Absolutely no other parts on the Mercedes car, so they are very confident ahead. Rosberg and Hamilton both getting a decent amount of laps under. I mean, in general, the entire field didn't get a lot of running done in free practice 1 and 2. For some reason, even Mercedes didn't do that much running. I think maybe they all just want to save the engine a bit more this year with only 4 engines instead of 5. Maybe we won't be seeing as much running as we used to in FP1 and FP2, because I thought in FP2 we might see quite a few long runs, but, the long run stints were only, a couple of maybe 15 laps or so on each stint, so not too long and not that much action for Mercedes, but they look very strong indeed. But the big thing is, Nico and Hamilton still said they're not happy with the setup. They're still going fastest, they're still banging in the lap times, but at the end of the day, they said they still weren't fully happy with the setup, which is a sort of a good problem maybe to have, the fact that you're not comfortable with your car setup and yet it's still fastest. So I guess when they find that sweet spot, they'll be even faster. I don't know, I dread to think, because they're already so far ahead. So yet again, they're the team to catch, and probably the team that no one will catch in the season. But it looks like another kind of Hamilton versus Rosberg 2.0 duel. No real other team can get close to them at this point in the season, and I doubt they will for the rest of the season. So looking all very ominous for the season for Mercedes, and looks like they'll just be battling once more for the constructors. Well, not constructors, but anyone. They'll be battling with the drivers themselves. So that's Mercedes. Moving on to the next team, which will be Williams. Fortunately, as we move on to Williams, there are a few things to look at on the Williams car. So straight away, we've got on screen right now, we circled just these vortex generators on the outside of the cockpit. So those will be just to generate some vortexes of air that kind of, bump over the side pods and go towards the back of the car. So that's one thing that they brought new that wasn't seen at the Barcelona test. Then we move on to this nice shot of the side pod. Now, this is more just kind of analysing at Williams' kind of approach to, F1 in general and what they've been like for this year and last year, which is aero efficiency. They're all about aero efficiency. We've seen at tracks like, Hockenheim and Italy, they were very, very strong last year, and that was because of their aero efficiency, and they've gone the exact same way this year again, whereas they're not going for outright downforce. They're just going for the sleekest car they can get, the most slipperiest car they can get, and also being very reliable. That's sort of their thing. They'll finish the race, and, the tracks which have, long straights, they'll be able to really compete with a really slippery car. A place like here, Australia, plenty of corners corners, lots of long sweeping corners, so maybe Williams won't be at their strongest, but they're still going to be very good. The point with this aero efficiency package is it's still good enough to go around these circuits that require a bit more downforce, but at the same time they're not getting bogged down in the straights with drag, and when you get to higher speed circuits with longer straights, they'll really benefit. You can see on screen I've just done in a dashed line a usual sort of, you know, what other teams have done. I think I've sort of tried to trace like a Ferrari style side pod, or even a Mclaren or Red Bull or a Toro Rosso. All these teams have done a sort of dashed line, as I've put it on there. That's the sort of side pod shape they have going towards the diffuser, whereas Williams, you can see it looks chunkier, it looks a bit more draggy, but really what that is just a slippery body, because the air will pass over that curved surface and just follow it because it's going so fast, and it will be just shot out the back of that car. So very slippery car Williams have, and again going for aero efficiency once more like they did last year. And finally, just to note, we have a little winglet on the top of the Williams. We saw that on launch car, so they've kept that, so it looks like it's working for them at the moment. Ferrari were actually the first ones to, I think, debut that sort of wing last year in Australia, so eventually Williams looks like they've nicked that idea as well, and it looks like they worked for it. It works for them in testing, otherwise they wouldn't put it on the car. There's no point in just keeping parts in the car if it's not really doing anything for you. And then just a little note, just circle the camera pods just to show that other teams like Williams, you know, the likes of Sauber, you know, or maybe the teams that maybe don't have the funds to maybe research into this, or maybe, you know, people like Williams, maybe they're not going for, you know, they don't need to really go for the exact maximum kind of aero they can get even from the camera pod, so they just stuck them on the actual chassis, you know, the nose cone of the car. They haven't tried to do anything fancy like Mercedes or even Ferrari, as we'll see later on. But yeah, that's the Williams car. A few nice little details, but pretty much the same as in testing. Not too much has really changed. So for all these cars, if nothing much has changed, guys, then if you're new around here, then do check my channel for the Let's Talk videos I did before on the launch car tests. You know, I analysed all the launch cars, so you can see the actual full analysis of all these cars if nothing much has changed towards Australia, because I'm literally just talking about the changes of the car, because I don't want to analyse the exact same stuff I've done in other videos previously. So that's been Williams. Let's move on to the next team, which will be Ferrari. So Ferrari have improved much this year. They're really looking good, and actually they look like they may be trying to challenge Williams and potentially have overtaken Red Bull to try and get that kind of third spot in the pecking order, really. Ferrari looking really good. Their engine looks like it's improved, but also their aero has improved quite a lot. Here's the rear end shot of the Ferrari side pod. Really nice Coke bottle shape there, going to swooping to the left and coming back to the right towards the diffuser area, which I've circled. That's the sort of area they're kind of aiming to chuck the air in. And also they've got some nice little fins on the floor of the car, so any air passing on the floor that hasn't been dragged along on the side pod surface then will be kind of affected by these little winglets, and that'll try and move air around that big chunky rear tyre. So as we move on to the rear of the car, Ferrari have maintained the rear vanes near the rear wheels of the cars like we saw at launch spec, and just I wanted to circle some really nice aero details. Just thought it was quite interesting. It's nothing actually new, they had this in testing, but it's just a really nice shot, some nice detail of the Ferrari car. But in general, the Ferrari car looked very good in the two practice sessions. It was a lot more balanced, and especially when Vettel and Raikkonen came into the section at the very end of Sector 2, the high-speed chicane, the left and right, they could really just kind of chuck the car in. Wherever they pointed the car would go, and that was a big issue for Kimi Raikkonen, especially last year, and that's why we're seeing him praise the car so much this year. And it looks like Vettel's also very comfortable in there. It's got a lot of nice balance, so that means it's got a lot of drivability, which is a word I think you'll hear me say quite a lot now, because it's something that Red Bull are having lots of issues with, just general drivability, allowing the drivers to push the car to the max, not being forced and boxed in by what the car can do. But as you see on the screen right now, Ferrari just with that little winglet on top of the airbox, they've had that for like a year now. They debuted it at last year's Australian Grand Prix, and just looking at the camera pods, they've gone a sort of Mercedes style way, except their ones aren't as thin going onto the camera pods, and it sort of blends in a bit more with the nose cone. Looks a little bit odd, but you can't really, to be honest, you can't really notice it that much, apart from when you look at it from the T-cam. They sort of look like kind of like horns coming out the car when you look at it from the T-cam. And then just looking at the elements of the Ferrari, they got a 3-element wing going on, so not as complex as the Red Bull and Mercedes, which have 4 to 5 element wings. So Ferrari's still a little behind on that, but obviously they're trying to focus everywhere on the car. You can't just focus on little bits like the front wing. You know, you have to focus on everything to try and improve the car. And then I've just put a little arrow towards the brake ducts. Obviously, I talked about the launch Ferrari, McLaren, and Red Bull all running blown wheel nuts. So basically, any air that goes in the brake ducts, a part of the air that goes into the brake ducts won't even go to the brakes. They'll just come straight out of the wheel nuts and blow the air towards the back end of the car, which will really kind of box in air to allow it to kind of neatly go towards the back of the car for the diffuser once more. But that's been the Ferrari analysis. We're going to move on to Red Bull now. So no more are we seeing the camo livery for the Red Bull. They've finally unveiled their actual livery now, and it looks pretty similar to last year's one, except that it looks like the purple's a lot more abrupt, stopping with the blue. It's not so much of a blend. But as we see the Red Bull, we can see a lot more of the actual curvature of the car. We can see the side pod. We have a really nice undercut on the side pod, just as you can see on the underside of the Infinity logo. I've drawn a line there. That's where the side pod starts to really cut in on itself, and then the actual side pod itself's got a really nice curve. It actually curves in a lot more than last year's car, it seems. So last year they obviously had to do a lot of kind of compensating for the Renault engine. Look, this year it looks like they've been able to package it a little tighter, but we'll get back to the Renault engine. Actually, Red Bull really not happy with Renault in Australia, but just also showing the lines coming off the blown wheel nut. So that's what the air will do. It will pass through the brake ducts, come out that wheel nut, and will blow to the rear of the car and kind of keep all the airflow coming in like that. So as we move on to the next picture now, we can just see a detail of the rear wing. Not highlighted it because you can clearly see the nice slot gaps in the Red Bull wing. Really nice complex rear wing there of the Red Bull, and is pretty much the same as testing. But now we move on to the next shot, which is the Red Bull in the garage, and they've got the front wing off, and this is where you can see the inside of the S duct. So on the main part where you see the Total sign, that is where the S duct exit is, and you can see on the actual bulkhead itself, that's the S duct middle section, the main section that brings the air from the front of the car to the top of the chassis, and it exits out, and that smooths the air over the car. I mentioned it again in my Red Bull analysis. So for all these cars, if you're new around here, again, I do recommend go looking back at the car analysis I did for all these cars when they launched. And then I've just highlighted as well the turning vanes on the bottom of the car. Those will always try and help push air to the barge boards, and then that will move air to the rear of the car. A lot of the aerodynamics of these cars are actually done underneath. There's a lot of turning vanes like this that really do help the car out. And then just a few little turning vanes here and there, and vortex generators on the side pods there, just a note on the Red Bull. But in general, the Red Bull, they have some issues. There are some big issues with Renault. I think they even went out to even call out Renault and say Renault really haven't improved the engine from last year, apparently. And that drivers, well, Ricciardo at least was complaining quite a lot. I think Kvyat also complaining about the same thing, or he's having issues about drivability. Just the Renault engine is really not that great for drivability. And that what essentially that means is, the engine does actually affect quite a lot of the way the driver can drive the car. Because, when you're coming to a corner, the Mercedes-powered engine cars can get all their braking done, all the gear shifts done before they even get to the corner, before they start even turning into the apex. And then they turn into the apex, and because the engine delivers such a smooth power kind of curve coming out of the torque curve out of the corner, they can really get on the power about, just as they're exiting the apex, they can be confident about slowly putting down the power, and it's a really nice smooth curve of power coming out of those rear wheels. Whereas the Renault engine, and, seemingly it looks like also the Ferrari, and also especially the Honda at these early stages for Honda, it's all very jaggedy. When the driver puts his foot down, it's not a smooth curve. It's little blocks of power that kind of come out and kind of shake the car about a little bit as they exit the corners. And going in, especially as well with the harvesting, some of these engines aren't so good, especially I think the Renault, it's not harvesting so well. So into corners, it's just not very, punchy, as we've seen Red Bulls of the past be like. So that's something that Red Bull have complained about quite a lot, and they've sort of put the blame straight on Renault, nothing more really. And finally, Red Bull were meant to try and put a new nose on this Red Bull. They're actually meant to go for a shorter nose. At the moment, you can see on screen, this is their old nose, the one they're running at the moment. With the thumb nose. Unfortunately for Red Bull, they haven't been able to crash test the short nose. It's proving quite difficult for them to get this kind of stubby, very short nose like Mercedes and Lotus have got. I understand it's very, very actually difficult to get that one crash tested, and Red Bull are finding it a little tricky to crash test it. It's all well and good coming out with the ideas, but you have to make it comply with the safety regulations. So Red Bull's struggling there a little bit, and they're on the back foot in general. And also Ricciardo also had to change his engine during free practice 2. I believe he hasn't lost the engine he changed out, but he had to go to a new one, but he will still use the one he had before later on in the season. I don't believe he's actually lost that one, like some reports said, I think. So Ricciardo, a few issues there with the Renault engine. In general, the Red Bull team not very happy in the camp at the moment. A bit of uncertainty there. And I think Christian Horner will be rather nervous on the pit board when they go into qualifying. We're going to the next car now, which will probably be McLaren. So there's not much to talk about with McLaren, to be honest. They didn't do very many laps. I think a total of, around, 20-ish mark in total from FP1 and FP2 for Magnussen it was, because Magnussen actually crashed out in FP2. You haven't seen the pictures. It's on screen right now. He basically went... I think the story is, or what he's saying, is that he went too fast into the corner and lost the back end. But there are a few analysts that had a few theories that maybe the McLaren car and the Honda engine had a bit of a problem at the rear, and that sent his rear snapping out. But whatever it was, it sent Magnussen into the barrier, and that red flag the session FP2. But not much to say from McLaren. They've got a lot to go, a long way to go. I think, to be honest, like they said at the beginning of the season, I don't know why people are surprised, or to be honest, I've seen a lot of people bashing them. I don't know why they're doing so, because they themselves have said from the start, they've said it might take till the European season until they get up to speed. So, to be honest, as a Jenson Button fan, so I'm rooting for McLaren. I don't really see too much of an issue with this. I think this is what we could have expected from McLaren, and I think we're just going to have to be patient with them and see what they come up with once they get the Honda engine up to goods, because obviously, even though they didn't have a season out, they didn't have a season of practical testing out the engine, whereas every other manufacturer has. So they do have a lot of catching up to do, and here's hoping they work as fast as they can. But yeah, not too much to say from McLaren. Doesn't look like they brought any sort of major updates to the car that I can see of. They're really just working on reliability, which probably is the most important thing right now for McLaren. So we'll move on to the next team, which will be Force India. So the first major running for Force India, obviously they only launched their car in the final test, and they didn't, they got quite a lot of laps in the final test. But as a whole, Force India still had to do quite a bit of catching up in this practice session. So I think they did probably one of the most kind of biggest runs out of all the teams in today's practice session. So just a few details on Force India. Obviously, I never actually did an analysis of this car, so I guess we can do like a mini analysis of the car for the first time. So the Force India sports an S-duct, much like the Red Bull car, but they've actually gone even more extreme than Red Bull, and that S-duct exit is absolutely huge. They've gone for a thumb-style nose. Looks like they've only got a 3-element wing. Looks quite basic, even more basic than the Ferrari. So, Force India looks like they've done a bit of R&D on the S-duct, but still not really that complex on the front wing like other teams have been. The side pods look very neat, actually, very nice and tight. On the rear wing, they've got a few slot gaps like some other teams have sported. And in general, Force India looked okay. Just looks like they have to get a lot of mileage on their belt. Obviously, they missed a few tests. So even though they did do quite a few laps in the third and final test where they launched the car, it's still not enough for them. They really need to catch up a little bit on the other teams. And I think right now that you won't see the full performance of the Force India. I think eventually we will, maybe in Malaysia, or maybe even, by the time we get to Q3 and Force India get through to Q3, I think we may see the actual full performance. But right now, I think they're just trying to get laps on their belt. But just a little picture of the huge S-duct, really quite big compared to the Red Bull car. And it's the same concept, obviously, getting air to the top of the chassis from the bottom of the car to smooth over the air flowing over the top of the car. But in general, very nice looking car. Obviously, livery is very nice, and new livery from last year's. But a very tidy car. On the rear, you can see on the side, going towards the side pod, towards that rear of the car, towards the diffuser. Very nice, tightly packaged. So, yeah, general, very good car from Force India. I think it'll be another solid kind of car that they want to try and overtake McLaren once more, the constructors. Once more, I think this season, it will be a case of maybe Force India ahead of McLaren for quite a long way of the season, especially with the Honda engine. I think Force India may be quite a bit ahead of McLaren, but then I think you may see McLaren start to pull them back, because eventually it's the pattern of Force India. They just eventually run out of funding through kind of halfway through the season. Force India do, so they just can't research and develop any more parts of the car, so they just kind of slowly fall back, and eventually, we've seen like last season, McLaren were able to catch them up eventually by the end of the season. So I think it'll be pretty much the same story. I think Force India, they just still haven't got enough funds ever to kind of really push out the mold that they're in right now as a solid midfield team every single season. But that's been Force India. We'll now move on to the sister Red Bull team, which is Toro Rosso. So Toro Rosso is going to be the last team with quite a few major Aero updates to actually analyse, because the rest of the teams actually didn't do that much in practice. So Toro Rosso, very nice Coke bottle shape at the bottom. We've seen, obviously, in testing that was still there already, but just you can see from this angle some really nice detailing on the floor. Just a few little veins there coming off the floor surface. So again, like with the Ferrari picture we saw previously in the beginning of the video, just any air that doesn't actually get attached to the side pod, doesn't go along with the side pod, will get affected by these veins. And actually, you can see I've actually missed out to actually highlight it, but you can see on the rear wing some really nice veins on the kind of right-hand side of the rear wing, just under the A of the Cepsa sign. You can see some really nice veins flicking up, so that will be to channel air upwards, and that will create a net downforce on the rear wing. And the Toro Rosso car generally looks quite good. They have a few issues. I think they just have to work through it like most of the teams. Obviously, with two young drivers, it's a big learning process for the entire Toro Rosso team with these two young drivers, but it's going to be interesting to see what Toro Rosso can do. Again, Renault powered, and again struggling with a bit of drivability, much like their sister team Red Bull. But on the Toro Rosso as well, on the turning vanes, we saw some nice slot gaps on the turning vanes. Also, Williams actually sported this as well. And this is much like Williams. What they're going for is aero efficiency. So not all the air is going to be affected by the turning vanes. Some of it will go through these slot gaps and just go straight through to the rest of the side pod. That's just being a bit aero efficient. Obviously, Australia, you do need a fair bit of downforce, but there are a few good straights, and it is generally there are quite a lot of high speed kind of swooping corners that kind of flow into each other, so you don't need maximum downforce. So I guess these slot gaps are trying to just get a bit of air efficiency there on these side pods. And then finally, Toro Rosso, you may have missed it, I didn't actually cover it in testing, but Toro Rosso changed their nose. They went from a kind of Ferrari style, McLaren style, very long flat nose, to the stubby thumb nose that Williams have sort of sported, and Red Bull indeed have also sported. So in case you missed that, Toro Rosso with a new nose there. So now we'll move on to the remaining teams, which will be Lotus, Manor and Sauber. So we're going to start off with Lotus. Lotus, obviously, with their new Mercedes engine. They had a few niggling issues. Grosjean had to sit out much of free practice 2. I believe he got out from this virtual safety car right at the end, but he had a few problems with his floor. I think that might have been actually free practice 1 or 2. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But the Lotus car in general, it looked like when Pastor Maldonado was on track, I think Maldonado got a few more laps than Grosjean in general in practice. It looked like Maldonado was able to chuck the car around a little bit more than he wanted to, with quite an aggressive driving style that he has. But it generally looks like the Lotus going through, especially the high-speed chicane. James Allen on track for F1, for the F1 Access website, noted the Lotus looked a lot more planted than last year's car, which was, as he called it, like driving a shopping trolley, which is quite a nice way to put it. So the Lotus definitely heaps and bounds better than last year. Moving on to Sauber, obviously they had a few off-track issues. I'm not going to be talking about any of it because I am purely here to talk about the cars. I'll let all the politicians and whatever and all the boring lawyers talk all over the absolute hot mess that Sauber have been off track. But on track, Sauber, they didn't do any running on FP1 related to the messes they've had off track, but in FP2 they got some running. The Sauber, not a lot of update at all. It's pretty much a sign of how cash strapped they are. The car is pretty much like last year's car, except with just a new basic nose that meets the regulations, and they really haven't developed that much. And again, Sauber, I think they'll be struggling to even get into Q2. I think they'll be probably definitely contenders for Q1 getting knocked out. Having said that, though, really with the McLaren reliability, McLaren could also be knocked out in Q1 easily, and I'm not surprised by that. I think, getting back to sort of off topic from Sauber, getting back to McLaren, so many people have been bashing them really on social media and stuff, and I'm just confused at why, because what else would you expect? That you've seen in testing the reliability, and I really came into this believing they would probably go out Q1 and really actually would have a double DNF. So I think anything more than that, they can be very, very happy with that. I think they really won't be competitive at all until you get to about Spain or even Monaco. So really, I think that's not really too much of a surprise. But that's off the topic. Let's get back to the rest of the team. So the only team left is Manor. Obviously, this big kind of underdog story. Have what you will about the story. I'm not going to share my opinions about it. I think it's been over-talked quite a lot on terms of, is it, good that they're in the sport or is it not? But all I'm going to say is the car is very, very raw in terms of the actual, development. It does look like, a lot of people have remarked, it sort of looks like a GP2 car, really. They've got a very, very basic front wing. The bottom wing element of the front wing is sort of almost just like a long kind of flat plane where they've got no real aero detail. And the car looks very plain, no sponsor sponsors, and that's pretty much all I can talk about, really, because they don't have many aero details to go on with that Manor car. But they didn't get out at all in free practice, because obviously they haven't done pre-season testing, so they just treated practice like pre-season testing. So not too much to talk about with Manor. But you know, here's hoping they actually get on the grid, because it'd be a shame if they came all the way not to get on the grid. So it'll be very tough, because they're still having to work on it overnight, I'm sure, and during free practice 3 I don't think they'll even get out. But here's hoping they can get into quali for at least one little lap, installation lap if you will, maybe, and maybe get onto the grid. If not, it'll be a bit of a shame, but I guess what could you expect, really, with the amount of pressure they've had. They got this together within a few weeks of the Grand Prix weekend being opened. But yeah, that has been Let's Talk F1 2015, the Australian Grand Prix. Quite a long video there, so I hope I didn't bore you too much, and hopefully those of you that appreciate aerodynamics appreciate that analysis and the video in general. And if you missed FP1, FP2, I hope I caught you up in the general kind of patterns of the team. So I generally think the pecking order is sort of Mercedes clearly out in front. It'll then be a fight between Ferrari and Williams, I feel, and then Red Bull, if they can get their act together, they may be in that fight as well. And then we have the likes of, I think you're going to see Toro Rosso, I think you're going to see Force India, Lotus up there kind of fighting each other. I then think you're going to go back one more stage, and then you're going to see the likes of Sauber, McLaren and Manor fighting out. Have I forgotten a car? I don't think I have. It's a bit confusing, because obviously we've got one less team, so it's always easy to forget a team, but I don't think I forgot one there. So I think that's the general pecking order as we saw. So the main stories: Mercedes way out ahead, Ferrari big improvement, lots of good drivability, Red Bull really not good for drivability, Renault engine really hasn't been improved. They're complaining quite a lot. The Williams car, again, solid reliability, gone for aero efficiency. The Mercedes looks planted as ever. The likes of Sauber really not developed anymore. McLaren still have to get used to the Honda engine. That will take them at least 5 races. And for the other teams, Lotus, Force India and Toro Rosso, solid mid-pack once more, like last season, really. Lotus have improved a little bit, so I think Romain Grosjean especially, I'm very happy for him, that I think he'll get a better car to try and show off his talents again once more like he did in 2013. But in general, that is the story of free practice. I think it will be quite an interesting qualifying between the Mercedes for pole position, and then behind, I think it will be a very interesting battle. Vettel and Kimi very, very close together. That is great to see after the terrible seasons they both had. Really happy to see them both really fast and actually very close to each other. I think that will be a battle to look out for, a very interesting one during the race. Ferrari and Williams, that will be my tip for the biggest kind of nice battle during the race, apart from the Mercedes, obviously. And I guess it'll be kind of nice at the end of this video to do little predictions. And if you got this far, then do tell me your predictions for the race. I want to know your top 3, or even your I think top 10. I think top 10 will be a bit harder to predict, so I want to know your top 10. Tell me what your top 10 will be for what the race results will be. When the race ends, what you think the top 10 will be like. I don't think I have a definitive top 10, but definitely for sure, I think the Mercedes obviously going to be 1-2. I can't really tell which way round it is. I think you're going to have to say just, you know, because he got the World Championship, he'll have a bit of momentum probably still from over the winter. I think maybe Hamilton might have it, even though he has been on the back foot a little bit in terms of the practice. Rosberg's been putting in the better lap times than over winter as well. But, you know, the Mercedes, you know, you can't really separate them, so they'll definitely 1-2. But I think, you know, Sebastian Vettel does have it in him to get 3rd place. I think he may be able to get that final podium position. I think maybe you'll see Bottas perhaps right behind him, and then maybe Kimi Räikkönen and Massa in the mix there. And then, well, Red Bull hoping that Ricciardo and Kvyat are right behind, and then maybe you can mix in maybe one of the Toro Rossos and Force Indias, and then maybe one of the Lotuses. But I can't really myself kind of narrow it down to a top 10. But in the past, I know you guys make some pretty bold predictions. So tell me your top 10 or any kind of bold predictions. You know, any kind of surprise DNFs or surprise finish. Do you think McLaren will finish the race by surprise? I for one think they'll probably double DNF, to be honest, in my opinion. I'm a McLaren and Jenson Button fan, so you know I'm being quite realistic there by saying they'll probably double DNF there. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Tell me your predictions in the comments below. Give it a like if you did enjoy it. Share it with your fellow F1 friends and fans if you have them. So yeah, if you enjoy this video again, give it a like. Subscribe if you're new around here for weekly F1 content and more analysis like this for every single race weekend of this season. I've been Aarava, and I'll see you guys next time.